Hello. This subject matter is something that might upset some people, either because they haven't thought about it, or maybe they've thought about it and just don't understand it, don't like it, or other people who might violently disagree with this opinion. Probably there's certain people who buy into the narrative about improving society, through make it more and more diverse and trying to be very inclusive, which are all nice ideas, but with the end result being what it is, when you point that out to some people, they're very upset because they're actually being challenged to face the reality of what's actually happening. So the title, De-Evolution, which is basically evolution going into reverse. And in order to understand this, you need to have some perspective on history. And most people now don't really know much about history, partly because of this whole process. People's level of education and knowledge is unfortunately getting worse, not better on average. So most people really don't know anything about the history of the early 20th century or the 19th century before that, and going further back, even less as you go back in time. So in order to explain why I'm saying that we are de-evolving in modern society, and note that I'm saying modern society because you do have some societies around the world which have been historically developing nations, or very poor, or what used to be called third world countries, which are actually progressing very well and modernizing successfully without all the problems that we see in decaying Europe and North America, etc., places like Australia and New Zealand as well. But there's a real malaise that's very apparent. Anyway, if you go back in time to the Industrial Revolution, at the beginning of this, it's sort of the end of the feudal period, if you like, where the vast majority of people in Europe, in North America, in fact most countries, most people were involved in agriculture, and most of them couldn't read, most of them couldn't write, they were barely numerate. Some people probably couldn't count past 10. And a lot of people didn't even have shoes. So that might seem shocking to some people, but that was the normal life for a lot of people. A lot of people were basically what's referred to as peasants, sort of serfs. Serfdom was ended in most countries into the 19th century. I think Russia was the last country to actually outlaw serfdom, and I think about 1897 or something like that. I think could be wrong about that one. Could be a slightly different date, but it was certainly very late. So, although these people generally were well fed because they're producing food, they would have to give a lot of it to landowners and lords and what have you. And as the Industrial Revolution took hold, you got the mechanization of so many activities, and people moved into different areas such as working in textiles, and you got huge urban centers building up in Britain and Germany, North America, etc., etc. And things changed. There were like the equivalent of billionaires back then, but the big difference between then and now is a lot of these people saw the value in investing in society. A lot of these sort of super rich people built hospitals, they built entire towns, they built schools, etc. And over time, working conditions in factories, etc., did sort of improve, especially in the early 20th century, very much due to unions as well as sort of increased sort of recognition of a need for people to have some kind of dignity as human beings and not be treated like, well, vermin. So over this period, really, of the 1800s into the 1900s, the last century, you got this process where people became richer, people became better educated, they had better health, more opportunities, the ability to change your work instead of, say, being this, son or daughter of a potter, and that's what you're going to do because your parents did that and your grandparents did that and your great-great-grandparents did that, and that was all you were ever going to do. People had the opportunity to become upwardly mobile and actually change career, maybe go to college, do something completely different. So people from very poor backgrounds have managed to become like brain surgeons or leading lawyers, whatever. Whereas that wouldn't have been possible generations ago, except for a very few number of individuals who were like noticed as exceptionally brilliant. There might be some pauper in a village who was noticed by somebody in the church, and quite often people who were poor got their education through the support of the church, But other than that, unless you had a benefactor who was sort of, a lord or somebody who thought, oh, little Johnny or Sarah here, for instance, they're super smart, so I'm going to actually help them become something. So that kind of thing was very unusual. But then you've got a free education system, free colleges, free universities, etc., paid for by governments. So you had this kind of golden era, which I suppose peaked sort of just after World War II. But I think what has happened is the people who run the world see this as a failure, a total failure. And there's also another thing that's happened, which is the rise of technology to the point that automation is becoming the preferred option. Faced with having to deal with paying people to do the job, dealing with absenteeism, sickness, whatever, holidays, pregnancies, death, etc., etc. If you can use a machine, the machine doesn't need a break, the machine doesn't need a holiday. The machine's not going to complain that you're a shit boss or anything like that. So I think the penny dropped quite some time ago, probably in the late 60s, early 70s. Especially with the transistor revolution, and the possibility of machines doing things that were inconceivable. Now we've got AI that's coming online. So there really is no need for this vast army of plebeian workers and peasants to do everything. So there's no need for educated or able population anymore. So I would say what's happening now is very deliberate. It's the de-evolution of society. So it's become like normalized for people to become almost feral. If you're intelligent and articulate, quite often in a lot of places you'll be laughed at. You'll be ridiculed. You're not one of the lads because you can talk properly and express yourself, and you might what you're reading books for, that's only for like arseholes, that kind of attitude. And it's become normal to like carry weapons. You go into many parts of Europe, certainly in Britain, people are carrying knives on a regular basis, and there's a huge amount of crime. There's a huge amount of problems with alcohol, addiction to gambling, especially. There's almost amount of addiction to porn, and then there's the drug epidemic, and more sort of cheap drugs like fentanyl, like spice, which are so cheap that even like the poorest, the desperate can afford to buy these. So I think this is deliberate social engineering, conditioning. You've got this whole sort of ideology. They talk about, being inclusive and helping people. But what's happening is areas that were formerly well organized, calm, clean, tidy, safe, with people in employment are becoming dirty shitholes, full of drugs, full of vagrants, where there's like feces in the street, disease is becoming rampant. And it's not safe. It's not safe to go out even in the daytime. And these were like towns and cities that only maybe even 10 years ago were actually some normal, civilized places, and they're just devolving in sort of like the worst sort of unimaginable crap holes. And this could have been stopped, but local governments, national governments, they don't actually want to stop this process. They want to accelerate it. I think they want to just get rid of the plebs. And so whatever plebs are left will be uneducated, probably illiterate, because it's only take another generation or two before most people will be back to unable to read. They'll just be able to read emojis on a phone, and they won't actually be able to read real writing. And they'll have one language, which will probably be just slang, and most people will be unemployable, even if they wanted a job. I think this is very deliberate. So I think there will continue to be places like Cambridge and Harvard and all these places, and there'll be gated communities and rich people in the big country pile, and they'll continue to go to Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and what have you, or Melbourne University or something. And they'll have a great life, they'll be educated, they'll be civilized, they'll have all the benefits of a modern civilized technological society. And you know, those who haven't been like killed off in war or killed off by people stabbing each other or taking so many drugs that they just die, they will have a very different life. So this is the world of the 15-minute city, the World Economic Forum vision, I think, being pushed by other organisations like the EU, the World Health Organization, where you'll have a very much a two-tier feudal society again. We go back to feudalism 2.0, or neo-feudalism, some people call it neo-serfdom. So because it's not worth it for them to invest in society. They don't want to invest in society. They're de-investing. They're investing in themselves, in protected gated communities of even whole islands with bunkers and God knows what, and more for them, less for us. So the bulk of society around the world is going to sort of reduce to this common level of basic poverty and sort of poor education, poor opportunities. And while things have improved enormously in some societies like China particularly, they're realizing they don't have any need for huge amounts of graduates and very skilled people, and less and less need for peasants, because the move across the world will be towards automation of everything, the use of AI and robotics to do a lot of the tasks. So I would say that the bulk of the human population will be seen as surplus. In fact, some have suggested there will be attempts to reduce the global population to 1 billion or even 500 million, because people of average or lower than average intelligence are seen as superfluous and unnecessary and just a drain on the planet. So I think that's where we're going with all this. It's a very deliberate attempt to de-evolve the world. And I think as this continues, governments will just leave the scum, in inverted commas, to die from drugs and violence and sort of poor food, and sort of just decaying, desperate lives, while they continue to have the best of everything. It sounds very cynical what I'm saying, and it is very cynical, because I think there's been a lot of thought into how they could actually implement this without it appearing to be deliberate. I think there's sort of an air of incompetence. So we're supposed to believe that there's nothing they can do. There's nothing that can be done. We can't fix society. It's all broken. And we'll just try and redistribute people around the world. Maybe that'll make it better. But actually what that's actually doing is just making everything even worse. So you get people who whose standards are so low that they don't even, they're not used to even having a proper toilet in where they lived before, and you bring them to somewhere, you get things like people crapping in the street and people throwing their rubbish into other people's gardens or just leaving it out in the road. And then you end up with diseases. And, we're seeing a rise of what were medieval diseases. They're coming back because people they don't even understand basic sanitation and sort of self-care in terms of health. It's unbelievable. I wouldn't have thought it would be possible that basically from around the time of my birth in the 1970s, that we have managed to destroy all the progress that has been accumulated. When I think my father was the first person in my family to go to university. I went to university, for what it's worth. And now it would seem a lot of these degrees are pretty much worthless. But I think that was pretty much the peak point. Although our technology has moved on, if you look at the quality of life and what real wages are for most people, the quality of life has actually gone down. Because if you're on drugs and you're eating crap processed food, if you're addicted to gambling and addicted to porn and don't have a proper social life, if you go out to the park and there's a risk you're going to be stabbed, okay, so you've got a lovely Samsung or an Apple phone and a big ass TV in your house, but is that what really matters? These other metrics of just normal basic life are the ones that I think are important, and they seem to be declining very rapidly. So I would say the only thing you can do, really, I suppose, is try to help people around you, help your own family, encourage your own family and friends to read and to learn things and to live in a civilized way. I mean, what happens is, unfortunately, there's a mass exodus of people from what were formerly nice places as things get worse. And then that just accelerates the process as more people leave who are civilized and educated and interested in community. That just leaves the people who were the opposite, and then you just get rampant crime and all the other problems associated with a devolved society where nobody cares and everyone's just out for themselves. And then, if you've got problems with like a fentanyl addiction, you don't have a job, etc., the chances are that you're not going to be acting with anyone's interests, not even your own interests at heart. You're just going to be struggling from one day to the next like a savage, like a feral person. And that usually means that you're going to have a negative effect on everybody else around you. So, it's really desperate. It's terrible. I mean, governments could clean up these areas. They could send in police, arrest all these drug dealers, put people into therapy, try and rehouse the homeless, etc., etc. But I don't think any of these governments have any interest in actually doing any of that. They don't want to improve society. They're quite happy to let society collapse around them. And then, the people who are in parliaments and friends, with the big mega corporation owners, they'll be fine. They'll be living in some quiet part away from all the, hoi polloi and all the scum. Well, they'll be safe, and they'll probably have armed guards to keep the scumbags out, so there won't be any crime or rubbish or drugs around where they live, because they'll be actually protected by, armed security. And they'll have access to food, education, the best of food, like organic food, etc. And you can already see that. You look at the average diet of somebody who's sort of living in Manchester, who's like not got a good job, who works in Deals or something, or whatever, pound, whatever they call it in Britain. And, probably renting if they even have a job, it'll be somewhere awful. They're probably eating really cheap, nasty food from cheap supermarkets. Whereas, somebody that's living in a big mansion, they're probably eating steaks and salmon and fresh vegetables and fruit and salad every day, etc., etc. So, they're not going to worry about those kind of people who are having a rubbish life. They just don't care. And I'm afraid I do believe this is all entirely deliberate. This has been engineered because I think they'd see the process of the Industrial Revolution and the upgrading of life in general for everyone as actually a mistake. And I think they're actually deliberately trying to reverse that to re-enter the feudal age, but obviously it'll be techno-feudalism where the work is done by machines and AI instead of by actually plebs and sort of what have been called serfs and peasants in the past, because there's no need for them. So that's it really. That's my take on all this. I know it might upset some people, but I mean, I would love to see a fair world where everyone has a good opportunity to progress for themselves. I mean, I think it's deeply wrong, all of this. But it's been hugely politicized, this, and somehow some people seem to think it's okay. It's a good thing, that we're all reduced down to this terrible common level of sort of barely human anymore, sort of barely functional, because if it's like for the masses, for everyone, then it's okay. But why not? Why can't we all be elevated to a higher level of where everybody is educated, everyone has a decent life, everyone has a good home, water, food, electricity, educational opportunities, where people are encouraged to bring out the best in themselves? It seems to be that this upside down crazy society is really about reducing everyone down to the lowest common denominator. Instead of upgrading people, it's downgrading. And then it's just only, the likes of Ursula von der Leyen. She's pushing this agenda, but I mean, she's super educated, she's extremely rich. I'm sure her children, not that we get to hear anything about her family, but her children and her nieces and nephews, etc., all probably go to the best public schools in Germany, and they probably all live in fancy houses with wonderful electric cars and a few holidays a year. We'll never get to hear about all of that because, they don't want to rub it in people's faces. But people like her are advocating for this devolution at the same time where they're living high off the hog and having a wonderful time. And I can't imagine her going down to sort of a dime store in the middle of Hamburg, right next to where the sort of the injection rooms are, and all these people who are sort of staggering around in a stupor, sort of defecating in the squares and side streets. I don't imagine she'd be going down there to do her shopping, will she? No. In fact, she probably sends her driver out in a big, huge car with, other staff to go and collect the groceries and what have you. Well, it's too important to actually think about such trivialities as making food or cleaning the bathroom or whatever. This is worse than the worst excesses of the French just before the revolution that happened in the late 1700s. I'm not advocating for violent insurrection, by the way, but I think these people need to go. I think by non-violent means, if at all possible, would be the best way. But I think just like the elites of France then didn't care a jot for ordinary people, these people like her don't care one iota about you or I or ordinary people. And it's the same in many countries across the world. And they need to go. They shouldn't be allowed to impose this horrific dystopian future onto the bulk of humanity. So I think all we can do is try and raise awareness about what's actually happening and why. And I think that's where history comes in, when you understand the perspective of the last 200 or 300 years, and how we've ended up where we are now, then it makes a lot more sense. Okay, that's a very long video, sorry for rambling on, but I hope you found it interesting. And I think, spreading education about all of this is very important. It's only when you understand what's really going on that you can really make any efforts to sort of change things, or to sort of enlighten other people about the horrible mess that much of the world is in, and who is responsible for that. Okay, that's it. Bye for now.